Bom dia a todas e todos. Estamos aqui hoje com a luz da manhã. Disseram que faz diferença, então a gente resolveu tentar. Não, brincadeira. Nós estamos aqui com o professor Ergin Bulut, da Universidade de Koç, na Turquia, em Istambul. E ele vai estar discutindo com a gente hoje seu livro que chama A Precarious Game, The Illusion of Dream Jobs in the Video Game Industry. Um livro muito legal que a gente se propôs a discutir já há algum tempo, e é maravilhoso que a gente tenha o Bulut conosco aqui para discutir esse livro pessoalmente, né? Então vou trazer o Bulut aqui. Good morning for us, good afternoon for you, Professor Bulut. It's a pleasure to have you here. We wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us and to our audience. And I was just telling the audience we intended to discuss. We have this weekly broadcasts in which we discuss classical game studies titles related to politics. So we've been for the last month or so we've been discussing the Dyer Whitterford and De Poyter's Games of Empire, and for a while now we've been promising to discuss your book in this broadcast because it speaks it is very close to what we've been discussing there. And I was just telling the people that we are very glad to have you here so we can discuss it with the author. So thank you again, and it's on you, ladies and gentlemen. Ergin Bulut.
Thank you, dear colleague Thiago and Ivan, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm really honored to talk about my book to this distinguished crowd. And as I see the announcements in the comment section, Bomja, right? That's Bomja. Bomdia. Okay, sorry. So apparently, my friends who have been to Brazil, which I haven't, and I hope this is the first, step to visiting your beautiful country. I have a few friends who are basically in love with Brazil. They have been there, and we have a WhatsApp group, and one of them is crazy about Brazilian music of all kinds. He keeps us sending links of his favorite music with the announcement Bom Dia every single day. Believe me. So I will share this experience with him as soon as we're done with the talk. Okay, so let me go back to I see. So I'm trying to share my screen, and apparently I need to allow certain things to the computer. Your entire screen, Chrome, application, no, Microsoft PowerPoint, share. Chrome has lost permission to capture your screen. Okay, are you seeing my screen?
No, not really.
No. Okay, hold on. Share screen, application window, Microsoft PowerPoint, share. Chrome has lost permission to capture your screen. Follow these steps. Okay, I will follow those steps. What do? I go to security and privacy. Okay.
Ergin, you can try to sort it out while we talk to the chat. We'll try. I'm just going to give some announcements in Portuguese.
Okay, sounds good.
So feel free to try to solve your problem. Maybe you can send us the presentation and we can present from our end.
I see. I will.
While talk, we're going to pass the slides for you.
Okay.
Pessoal, o Ergin está tentando resolver um probleminha ali com o Chrome, que não está permitindo a apresentação do PowerPoint. Enquanto isso, a gente pode dar meio que uma introdução sobre o assunto, né? O livro chama A Precarious Game, né? The Illusion of Dream Jobs in the Video Game Industry. Ele trata um pouco sobre a questão, que é uma questão que a gente está discutindo muito aqui digamos assim, na esfera do pessoal que discute games e política, que é a questão da cultura do crunch, né? Mas o livro do Ergin, ele acho que vai um pouco além, e ele discute a questão do sonho do emprego de trabalhar com games, né? Que é uma das motivações utilizadas para justificar a cultura do crunch, né? Então, acho que ele tem essa vertente que é interessante. Ele conseguiu compartilhar a tela, então eu vou passar a palavra para ele. So, Ergin, feel free to begin your talk.
Okay, I assume you are now able to see the screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So again, thank you, Thiago and Ivan, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. So this is going to be basically a book talk, and feel free to interrupt or ask questions as I talk, or you can also, share your questions at the very end. So to briefly talk about my research, I do research video games industry from a critical political economic perspective. I'm interested in questions of technology and labor, and this is my first book, which is titled A Precarious Game: The Illusion of Dream Jobs in the Video Game Industry. So can you all hear me, by the way? I'm not familiar with this platform, so I just want to make sure that...
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay, wonderful. So today I want to do two things in the talk, which is to invite you and everybody in the group to think about the book as a story about how a startup dream turns into a nightmare due to financial capitalism. That's what the book is about. At a more upper level, at a theoretical level, this talk is an invitation to think about game production, not simply as an economic trade-off in the workplace, but a racialized and gendered problem of social reproduction and a problem of inequality rooted in politics. And this sounds like a complex sentence, and I'll try to explain what I'm trying to mean here. But basically, I'm trying to politicize our thinking about game production as an activity of labor. That's what I would like to do. And also I would like to do this in relation to questions of race and gender, because I think overall one of the things that is sort of missing from media production studies and game production studies is how we don't always link questions of exploitation in relation to race and gender. That's what I want to accomplish today, which is something I hope to have done in my book, where I ask two questions. First of all, what does love look like in the video game industry? Okay. And in this industry, I wanted to understand who can play and who has to work in this industry, because most of the time, as you would all know, there's a lot of talk and discourse about how work is fun in this industry, which it is. But at the same time, there are also inequalities. Some can really play and have fun, and this is not the case for everyone in this industry. So these are the two main questions that I was hoping to answer in this book. There's a developing literature on what we may call game production studies, which is, I think, a very useful term. And I first heard it from Brendan Keogh, who is based in Australia. He's a great video games researcher. And one of the typical arguments in game production studies and also media industry studies in general is a sort of pendulum between love and passion and self-exploitation, right? So the argument is something like this. Because video game producers love their jobs, they are inclined to self-exploit, right? So they work really hard, which gives us self-exploitation. That's why the argument tells us that these people are able to enter certain trade-offs in the workplace, right? Which is the trade-off between passion and exploitation. And again, at the end of the day, what enables this trade-off is love, right? So it's because these people love video games, because these people love what they do, they enter these trade-offs in the workplace. And I think there's a problem here, right? There's a conundrum here. Because when we use this language of trade-off here, what happens is we seem to be talking about video game production as solely an economic activity, which I will suggest that we stop doing, and we try to politicize work, right? Because once we enter this language of trade-off, what we do is basically to isolate video game production as solely an economic activity, as if it is independent from politics and from social reproduction, which is to say, we cut the links between the workplace and the house. We cut the links between the workplace and the city, right? We cut the link between the workplace from broader questions of gender and race, right? So that's one problem. And the other thing is, when we are speaking the language of the trade-off, we seem to be limiting love to a solely psychological kind of category, right? So we seem to be talking more about individuals and their hearts and their passion, as if there is not a social materiality to that love for the job. Okay, so that's what I'm suggesting, that there's a problem with the language of that trade-off. So I say, let's move beyond grasping game production as simply and as an economic process, as if there are two supposedly equal parties, which is the game developer and the company, right? To do this, I suggest taking into account the problem of politics and social reproduction, and I try to do this by way of engaging with feminist studies, affect studies, and try to make link with those areas, and also the political economy of communication, right? So this is the kind of interdisciplinary framework that I try to accomplish in the book. I introduced the term ludopolitics in the book to refer to the complex assemblage of multidimensional, uneven power relations at the local and global level, which ultimately set the terms of who can play and enjoy work as opposed to those who have to work, right? So what I'm trying to say here is basically there's a game studio that I did my research at, which I will talk about very soon. And then there are more structural relations, such as the parent company that used to own the studio that I was doing research at, right? So, and also the question of the domestic space in relation to that workplace as well. So there are multiple layers of inequalities that I'm hoping to clarify with this term of ludopolitics. On the one hand, the framework of ludopolitics describes how the organizational structure of my studio enables resourcefulness, cooperation, and communication amongst video game developers, right? So it sort of facilitates ludic forms of work among game workers. At the same time, this very framework will give us how to understand inequality at different and various levels. So what I argue is, through ludopolitics, on the one hand, yes, we understand how video game workers are being alienated and exploited in the workplace, right? So that's one thing. But at the same time, with its connections to social reproduction, with its connections to the domestic space, with its connection to questions of race, I suggest that ludopolitics also allows us to understand how the exploitation of the workforce is based on the exploitation and alienation of many others at different levels, right? So, and again, I will give you details, but the workforce in this game studio was predominantly a white male workforce, right? So, and what I'm suggesting is, yes, these people in the game studio were exploited and alienated, and I tell the story throughout the book, but at the same time, they were exploited and alienated because some other mechanisms or some other people, again, questions of gender and race are right there, they were enabling the exploitation and alienation of these people in the game studio, right? So that's what I'm suggesting to do with the term ludopolitics. I rely on two different key terms for video game studies overall. One is immaterial labor and the other one is precarity. I use the term immaterial labor in a critical sense, and I discussed this at length in the book, but by focusing on inequality and social reproduction, I hope to materialize immaterial labor, right? So the question here again becomes, how is immaterial labor possible, right? So what are the conditions under which the people are able to crunch in the video game studio? What are the conditions that enable the passionate work of these people in the studio? Okay, and precarity is another common term within critical studies of media and video game studies, and precarity is not new to capitalism, right? So we know that. What is to be noted about precarity is it has become the new normal in a way, right? It's become the hegemonic form of employment in the neoliberal context. It's not static, right? So we are, or it might be better if we actually talked about processes of precarization, which is basically fluctuations temporally, right? It depends on the time, of the whole organization and production as to how we can understand precarity is going up and down. And also, there are different levels of precarity across different sets of workers, which is what I found out in relation to the core creative team, such as the artists and designers and programmers, as opposed to the video game testers. So what I'm suggesting that we understand precarity is not necessarily limited to just the short-term contract, right? It's more of an affective condition tied to questions of finance capitalism, where precarity actually is productive, right? So it produces subjectivities who can also be invested in the very precarious forms of production, such as the video game testers, and that's where scholars like Lauren Berlant can become very, very useful in terms of her concept of cruel optimism. So why study video games, and how does the video game industry look like? I'm going to sort of skip this part, mainly because I assume that the crowd is not going to be willing to be convinced as to why we should be studying video games, right? So I'm not going to go at length here, but the cultivation of love in the everyday life is something I would like to talk a bit about in the future slides. So the whole notion of love, right? So and this is somewhat like a cultural moment in which we are witnessing the transformation of work at a very broad sense, in a cultural level, right? So the work is not supposed to be about toil. It's supposed to be about passion and fun and love. So I was once observing a college meeting where the game developers that I was studying were talking to college students who wanted to be part of the video game industry, right? So and the students were asking the game developers, what should we do? How can we get a job in the industry? And in addition to all kinds of formal skills, what was emphasized throughout this meeting, this promotional meeting, was being ambitious, right? So you should be hungry, you should be ambitious if you want to get a job in the industry. I also had a chance to interview video game players who came to the studio and participated in usability testing, right? So before the games are launched, video game producers will pay good video game players to come and play the game and suggest what is wrong or what is good, what works with a specific kind of game. So when you do this, the people basically love, right, being involved in testing, because they tend to feel as if there's a community, right, who owns the game. So that's something I think very important about how this whole notion of love is cultivated from below in very ordinary kinds of practices, which is the fun, I think, part of doing ethnographic research. And this also came up. This whole notion of love also came up in my fieldwork. Art director Theodore and I've met a few times, and at some point he said, "This is just like a roller coaster, and you should talk to others and see if they love what they do. Otherwise, you may not really enjoy being part of this machine, right?" So he emphasized love. And designer Siva, and I'm using pseudonyms all throughout, he likened video game development to being a parent, right? So you watch it grow, and you watch it start up incapable of doing anything, and then it learns more, right? So, and I would like you to pay attention to the gendered language here, right? So having a baby is hard, and it's especially harder for women, right? So there's a very techno-masculine kind of production culture here as well that I would like to emphasize. Programmer Matthew similarly said, "We're not here to be rich, it's just about passion, and it has to come internally," right? That's why we are putting those insane hours. And designer Silvio, who was above 40 years old when I interviewed him, he said, he took loans to get into this industry after working in all kinds of different kinds of jobs. He just took loans to go to Vancouver to study game design, came back to the US, and then he was an entry-level designer when I first interviewed him, and he took loans to get into this industry because of love. So I'm not gonna talk a lot about these numbers. So globally, the video game workplaces are fun places to work at. You get to be networked with international colleagues. You can drink alcohol at work. You can go out for jogging, come back, take a shower, and then go back to work refreshed, right? So there's a Googleization almost of the workplace, and symbolically valuable too, right? Because once I was talking to one of the developers' wives, and she said, I was talking to a fireman, and at some point he learned that my husband is a game developer, and he said, "Can he help me get a job in the video game industry?" Right? So again, this is a fire worker, and you see how it's symbolically quite valuable to be part of this creative class. And also, people tend to think that the industry thrives despite economic crises. On the one hand, this is true. Materially, these places are fun to work at. I've attended game launch parties when people were celebrating when their games were out. They were partying, having fun, dancing, drinking, and so on. But at the same time, it's very similar to other media industries. Work is exploitative, right? So these people work long hours, as we very well know from discussions that Thiago was mentioning, going back to the very classic book games of Empire and many other works that I can think of, such as A Precarious work has attested to this, right? Uncertain futures, and also the creeping of work into the most intimate spaces is what we tend to find out in many media industries. So these are not necessarily endemic to the game industry. So there are very interesting similarities between the game industry and other media industries, such as how workers desire autonomy, and if they're lucky, they're given that. They sign non-disclosure agreements, which are just like the exclusive contracts in the music industry. There's a lot of symbolic capital if you work as part of these creative industries. There's a blockbuster mentality in the AAA, right? Production especially. There's a future return system based on what Kuhn and Corrigan called hope labor, or what Brooke Duffy would call aspirational labor. But there are also some very interesting, important differences. such as the hybrid political economy, right? Which sort of meshes the old media economics and new media economics, where companies like Microsoft, Sony, Nintendo would be willing to lose money on consoles because money is in the software, right? So it's because of the proprietary nature of these platforms. These companies are willing to lose some money on the console because they will recover that loss with the games that they themselves publish as software. David Nieborg, I think, does a really good job to give us the idea that the games are different, right? Because they are platform dependent, and these platforms will define what you can do with the games technically and also economically as well, right? So there is something distinct about video games in terms of the platform that they operate. They have afterlives, right? It's all about upgrade cultures. There's a lot of expectation about what's coming next, when, under what conditions and what terms are you willing to pay $50 and even more dollars, right? Based on the DLC and so on. There's a distinct commodity form of the video games. And I think the materiality is important in terms of how we, when we play a video game, right? We are sort of like the author in the sense that we are in charge. We play against a code, which is a system. We play with the system. And with all of this, right? The materiality of the software, the materiality of code effectively inculcates the love for play and the aspiration to become a game developer, right? So there's something distinct about what you can do with video games in terms of how that love gets to be cultivated through the software and through code. And the mobile revolution, which I'm not going to spend too much time on. Okay, so how did I do the research about this book, and what is the context and why should we care, right? So the context is basically post 2008. Okay, this is the post financial crisis time. There's a lot of debate about the future of work and also how work is being transformed in cultural ways, where it's supposed to be about fun, right? So on the one hand, we are talking about things like automation, AI, and what's going to happen to work, which is a very big and important question. There's a lot of discussions about the gig economy in terms of how flexibility is fetishized, how algorithms are dictating certain kinds of work, and at the same time, right, in terms of the consumption side of video games, there's a mythic aura around video games, how it's about meritocracy. If you're a good gamer, then you're going to be fine and you're going to be going through levels. Video games inspire and produce a lot of hope. And they might also divert social energy from inequalities too, right? So the world of simulation is very productive. It will produce all kinds of different kinds of feelings or belief systems about meritocracy, hope, and how a different life can be possible. So the studio that I started, that I call Desire, okay, this was a medium-sized video game studio in the United States Midwest, and it was founded in 1996. And a publicly traded company that I call Digital Creatives buys Desire in 2000s, right? So after a while, Desire makes good games. And Digital Creative says, okay, I want you to be my internal studio, right? And they buy Desire. So Desire is no longer independent. And in fact, it becomes the flagship studio of Digital Creatives, producing the most profitable franchise of the company. So when I initially started my fieldwork, the people I was interviewing were telling me how they feel quite secure in their jobs. But the thing is, despite being the most successful studio of Digital Creatives actually declared bankruptcy in 2013. So when I started my fieldwork, it was 2010. And in 3 years, Digital Creatives declared bankruptcy, which was a big shock to the people that I was doing research with. So when I first started my research, there were 240 people in Desire. And when I was concluding my fieldwork, this number had been reduced to 186. And some were dismissed from their jobs, and some just basically quit and started to either look for a job in different industries, or they relocated to other cities to find a job in the video game industry. And after I concluded my fieldwork, an additional 30 people also had either resigned or they were dismissed. So I did ethnographic research, for which participant observation is very key. I attended team meetings, company meetings, in-house training sessions, especially of video game testers. I attended parties, and I also witnessed the very moment when a new company had acquired Desire. I interviewed 44 professionals, and I also interviewed 10 partners of these people, who all were women, because again, this is a male-dominated industry. I also interviewed a city official and a real estate developer because of Chapter 4, which I'm not going to talk too much today about, but at some point, when digital creatives bought Desire, they had to hire new people, right? A lot of people, which meant the space that they were working at would no longer be enough, which meant then they would have to relocate. And they had to relocate to the downtown area of a dying city in the Midwest, right? Which revitalized a dying downtown area, which was quite interesting. And I wanted to capture that in my book because, again, the city is quite important, right? Because you have to have certain infrastructures, you have to have certain things in a city to be able to recruit people or to retain people in your studio. So that's one thing I'm trying to do in the book. Okay, so the ludopolitical regime of production, I suggest, gives us 4 levels of inequalities. The first one is the inequality between the game studio that I did research at and the parent company in California. Okay, this parent company was a publicly traded company, which meant that they had stocks, and which gives us all kinds of complex relations of finance. And because of their bad investment decisions, the studio, despite their success, was having trouble. That's one level. The second level is between the privileged creatives and the precarious game testers, which gives us workplace inequalities. The third level is about gender and social reproduction. For the people in Desire to be productive, for the people in Desire to have fun, to crunch, somebody else was actually, picking up the slack at home, taking care of kids or the family in general, right? So that's, I think, a very important question that we have to come to terms with. And also, I identify a cultural logic of ludopolitics, and what I mean by that is this. The games that these people in Desire were making were adult games, right? So, and they have received criticism in relation to questions of racism and sexism. And I posed this question in my interviews and asked them, what do you think about this? And the standard response would give us, and the standard response had keywords such as, this is fun, this is escapism, this is nothing important, right? So I wanted to understand what it means to suggest that a sexist, game content is being coded as fun and escapism, right? So that's what I wanted to understand at this level of the cultural logic of ludopolitics. So the first one looks like this. Financial markets are coming after digital creatives, which is coming after the video game studio that I call Desire. When digital creatives acquired Desire, basically, they were expropriating the intellectual property of that was being produced in Desire. What happened after this? First of all, there was new bureaucracy at the studio, which the game developers did not particularly enjoy. And they had to come to terms with new corporate demands, which didn't exist before, right, when they were independent. So all of a sudden, somebody from California calls them and says, we want this in the game and not that in the game. So, they had to deal with these kinds of things. So they were even saying at some point how the corporate in California was acting as if they were the quality assurance team, right? So, and once you have a lot of new hires, there were new cultural shifts and frictions at the studio, right? So, and one of the things that I did during this research project was, because there's a lot of emotional work that goes into this particular kind of immaterial labor, I was not quite satisfied with the semi-structured interviews. So what I did was I asked the video game developers, the volunteer ones, to show me how it feels in this video game studio, right? So we were doing photo illustration where the volunteers would take photos of anything, a particular kind of object in the game studio, or anywhere basically, not necessarily limited to the video game studio, to show me how it feels to work at Desire, right? So this image is not quite the one that you would necessarily imagine to see, right, after this exercise. So Ronaldo, who was a technical artist, and he had stayed a long time in Desire as a worker, he brought me this image of the banquet tables that they used to work at when they were independent, right? So, and from this, we would talk about how a lot of frictions and new cultural shifts had taken place once digital creatives bought them out, right? All of a sudden, he starts to talk about the new culture at work, which is way more corporate, when people start wearing badges, for instance, right? So when you start wearing badges, what happens is it means that I don't really know you, or I may not really know your name, right? So from the independent days of the studio, which was very small, to an organization of more than 200 people. What also happened was what the game developers would call shades of dedication emerged, right? So some veterans, some long-time employees at Desire would tell me how they didn't quite see dedication in the new hires, which again, if we want to be more critical of this discourse, it gives us this whole idea of techno-masculinity, right? The techno-masculine work ethic at Desire, where dedication is something that only some certain people have, and there's this nostalgia of the good old days when everybody was extremely committed to work, but with financial security, there emerged shades of dedication in the studio. But at the same, again, right? So another moment that I have in the book, which is chapter 7, is the bankruptcy chapter, right? So the game studio publishes their most successful game, and they're happy, right? And they should be celebrating, right? As I talked to Ricardo, who was an artist. So he said, we should be celebrating, but holy crap, we should still be working on the downloadable content, because if we don't do this, the parent company may not make it another month, right? So game work in a financialized economy is basically a production machine, right? So that's kind of ties back into the notion that games have afterlife, right? So even if you do the console production with online production of downloadable content, you still keep working, and work just never ends. So studio becomes a machine, right? And people are not quite happy with this. So that was one level. The second level is about the precarious testers, which are the most precarious section of the workforce in this game studio. They love playing video games, right? So, and they don't necessarily have to have formal skills. You don't need a college degree to become a game tester. The only skill, which I think is an extremely important skill to have, is to play video games, right? To play video games, to love playing video games, and then you can be a tester. But the thing is, depending on the project, these people were hired, fired, and then rehired. So there were 11 full-time testers, and the rest of the team was being hired, fired, and then rehired depending on the qualifications of that specific person. And every once in a while they would be given promises of full-time employment, but this never became reality. So I draw on Frankfurt School and also the work of Herr Braverman, the great labor scholar, and coined the term degradation of fun, which happens through different kinds of levels. On the one hand, play becomes subject to time discipline that you have to complete, right? At the same time, you get to be surveilled in formal and informal ways where there are either Excel sheets or software that kind of tracks your productivity, or your colleagues would be also watching out, right? And crunch, I would talk the testers how they would describe crunch to me, and one thing that they emphasized was that they were paid really good money, right, over time. And I would say them, okay, what do you do with the money? And they would say, well, nothing, because we don't really have a life, right? So you love what you do, you get paid well with overtime, but the thing is you don't have free time to enjoy the money that you are making. And what they would call the second-class citizenship is also part of this degradation of fun, right? So they tend to feel a little bit more like serfs, right? So this is the kind of feeling that they have in what they would call the tester's pit, which is the name of the room that they were working at. I interviewed Martina a few times. Initially, she described video game testing as a dream job, right? So she would basically tell how she would do this job at half of the wage that she was being paid, and kind of making joke about it and say, don't tell my boss, right? So, but at the very end, right, she was kind of saying how the company was somewhat doing like a cruel joke to him, okay? And she was saying, I feel like I'm expendable, right? So I feel like all the work I put into this department was for nothing, and she was thinking that she may end up going back to college and so on. I'm still connected, right? I'm not talking to my screen.
Yeah, you're still here. No, it's
okay, great.
Fine.
Okay, thank you. So when play works your job, when play becomes your job, what happens is also you relate to play in a different sense, where even when you're playing, you're kind of testing, is what some of these people were telling me, right? So that's the biggest downside. Your pleasure that is derived from playing is reduced through degradation of fun. Now, the third level is how the technomasculinity of desire was being reproduced by the developers' partners at home, right? So that's what I want to talk about right now. And this is how it looks like. Financial markets was coming after digital creatives, which was coming after Desire, the studio, and now Desire is coming after home, which, of course, a story that I developed all the way back from Nicktar Witherford and Greg Deputer's classic piece in 2006 about the notorious EA spouse case. So the thing is, women have been, working for free, providing reproductive labor, providing emotional labor for centuries, right? So what is different here then? First, women are not constrained to home, right? They're mostly able to work in my case. So these were middle-class women who mostly had jobs. And the thing is, what Carol Pateman calls the sexual contract is intensified by new communication technologies too, right? So I'm not suggesting that this is entirely new. I'm just giving nuances as to what is sort of different in this case. So I was once talking to Isabel, who was married to studio architect for technical art, and she in fact burst into tears as we were talking about her, relationship with her husband and the kind of work practices. She was extremely proud of the fact that she was supporting her husband, right? So she was saying, I would have given up anything to marry him, right? And the most important thing for Isabel, who was a mom to 3 kids, was that her husband has to be happy with what he's going to be doing, right? Because he can be very serious, and if he's not happy at work, then that comes home, right? So there's a lot of emotional labor that seems to be going on here in the case of Isabel, who was one of the, I think she might be the one stay-home mom in the entire crowd, maybe two. Gina was an extremely witty woman. She was an IT professional, and she was extremely. I learned a lot from Gina, and she would keep teasing her husband. I once interviewed them together, and I would ask her what happens when he's crunching, and she says, "Well, he sure as hell wouldn't know. He's at work. I'm a single parent. It's like living with a college roommate. We occasionally catch glimpses of him, right?" So this is the kind of this is how life looks like when they're crunching. The critique of love at work came in the most incisive way from women in my research. Karen, who was married to a programmer, and she was the other woman who was not working at the time. She basically laid it out for me, right? Saying the love of it is a problem. Actually, you can almost love your job too much because he's there all the time, and that's expected. It is extremely expected. Work from home, and when you're not working, you should be reading about games. You have to be constantly in the game world. For the home life, that's a problem. There's no time left. So this is basically a very depressing description that we are all familiar with from the autonomous scholars, such as Hart and Negri, and the whole discussion about the social factory. But there's a very interesting critique of love here from Karen. So what was going on then, right, with these women? There's a very classed and ambivalent femininity going on here. On the one hand, these people are living middle-class lives, right? And they are being exploited as a resource at home, right? But at the same time, based on the narratives that they were providing, what I was seeing was a symbolically legitimate form of cultural capital that was tied to being a caring woman, right? A compassionate mom, and the fact that they were married to a game developer, right? So they were telling me interesting stories about how people approached them once they learned that they were married to a game developer. And the ambivalence comes from how these women, on the one hand, were endorsing this neoliberal rhetoric of choice, such as saying, we knew this before, we knew this, right? We knew going into the industry that this is how the industry works, right? Almost like a capitalist realist kind of sense that we would think in relation to Mark Fisher's work. At the same time, in addition to endorsing this rhetoric of choice, they were still able to critique the techno-masculine work culture, but still not really touching the heterosexual family unit, right? So that's still there, but we do get to see the criticism regarding the techno-masculine work cultures. Now, the fourth level of ludopolitics is the one that I suggested in relation to racism and sexism, which is the cultural logic of ludopolitics. I would ask these people what they think about the racist and sexist game content they make. I would ask them how they think about the criticism, right, about the work that they put in. And I was having a conversation with the veteran programmer, Matthew, and I said, so would you agree that this is a hard culture to live in, but it is commodified and sold mostly to white male audiences, right? So rather than saying yes, he's using a different kind of narrative here, saying we're definitely playing off of stereotypes of that culture, which is I think key here, which is African-American culture, regardless of whether those stereotypes are actually true or not. It is a romanticized vision of what that culture is. And the truth is that culture includes a lot of nasty stuff. The truth is less appealing. It's escapism. Okay, so there are lots of interesting work to engage in here, I think, in relation to the choice of words and use of words. The escapism thing, right? So the thing is, escapism and fun are always racialized and gendered practices. Game developers that I was studying enjoy work because they are able to poke fun at others in representational and technological terms. One developer would tell me how he would consider themselves as an equal opportunity offender, right? Meaning that we poke fun at everybody, black, white, man, woman, and all kinds of binaries, right? So Asian, Latino, and all kinds of like racial categories, right? So, but the thing is, who can occupy that universal position of poking fun at everyone else, right? So that's the white male kind of universal position, of course. So basically what I'm arguing here is that the pleasure of a white male labor force causes pain for the others, right? So what you may end up producing could be fun for you, but in fact, you have commodified other people's cultures with different kinds of stereotypes, and it does inflict symbolic violence on communities, right? So what? Okay, this is what the book is about. Now that I suggested that we should look at questions of inequality and think about social reproduction in relation to game production, what does this mean? I suggest that this sort of emphasis on inequality and social reproduction enables a critique of the institution of the employment relationship, which is fundamentally constitutive of economic liberalism and even at times of critical labor studies, which means even liberal, radical labor scholars tend to think in those like trade-off terms that I suggested at the very beginning, right? So that trade-off language will not take us far in terms of critiquing the entire relationship of employment. And when we have that, and that's the second thing is, when we have that emphasis on social reproduction and inequality, what happens is, I think, we are able to engage in a materials investigation of love and labor, as opposed to an abstract discourse of love at work, right? So once we start to make those connections between the workplace and the city, workplace and the domestic space, workplace and the parent company, right? So all of these things will sort of help us to materialize labor and love, I think, okay? So I suggest that we remember that employment is a political relationship, not simply an economic trade-off. It is through employment that actually alienation is legalized, right? Or everything becomes legal. But the thing is it just, right? Is it fair? Is it based on equality? The fact that something is legal does not mean that it is equal or fair. And once the employment relationship is ludic, then the coercive nature of employment sort of becomes invisible. So I argue that rather than looking at art and capital relation, drawing on the work of Matt Stahl, or Stahl, his last name I'm not quite sure how to pronounce, let's look at the question of employment and democracy, because how we organize work, how we structure work, right, is basically a question of democracy. It's not just about the economy, right? So rather than having the discussion of trade-off between art and capital, let's reframe the question in relation to democracy, because how we work is a matter of democracy, right? So, and continuing with the so what question, right? Or what it means to materialize love. Love is social. It is not just about my heart or my individual like psychology. It is communicated in colleges, as I draw from my fieldwork. It is practiced through game consoles, right? So it's through play. It's through social practices that love becomes something that you can feel and pursue. And also it is reproduced beyond the workplace in game developers' homes, right? And love of work in this industry is racialized and gendered. It thrives at the expense of marginalized others through white masculine production culture. So one of the great work that I can recommend here to think about questions of love is Miya Tokumitsu's wonderful book, Do What You Love and Other Lies About Work. A longish title, but Miya Tokumitsu has written a wonderful book about how we could critically think about love. Love of work, then, right, as a practice is rooted in post-racial white masculine production cultures, where the imagination is that we are living in a post-racial society and pushing the boundaries of what you can do with technology, pushing the representational terms and boundaries of what you can put in a game, right, are all sort of produced within post-racial white masculine production cultures. And I think with all this discourse of love, what I would like to call it somewhat like a soft authoritarianism is what we're witnessing at work, right? So love of work is exploitative, yes, but at the same time, once you suggest that you should love what you do, you're somewhat contributing to a soft authoritarian labor regime at work, right? That's what I would like to call it, and it's also the content of the new piece that I'm working on these days in terms of how we can connect questions of authoritarianism and labor in this industry. And I guess everybody would agree with this, which is inequality in this industry is not a bug but a feature, right? So what about the question of resistance? And I'm coming to the end of my talk. I did not see too much enthusiasm or even reflection on the idea of unions, but Game Workers Unite is one of the exciting developments that we see in the video game industry, and workers who we tend to think as disorganizable are actually organizing. And I haven't done research about Game Workers Unite, but Jamie Woodcock has done research about this, and Games and Culture published a paper, I think. Television and New Media, the special issue that Greg DePuter has done with Chris Paul, has published a piece about game workers organization. And I think there's a really interesting dimension of gender and sexuality to be reflected upon in relation to questions of organizing in the digital media industry. So overall, as we find ourselves in the age of automation, as we reflect on the future of work, right? Like I said, I think there's an authoritarian dimension of the whole do what you love kind of regime here. What the book really is for is sort of, let's, stop and think about what work really is for, right? Because again, love can be too consuming, right? And it can produce cultures of emotional toxicity. That's what I call this in the book, where you sort of expect others to work as much as you do, right? Which is the debate that came up in Red Dead Redemption 2, I think. And also, let's just try to imagine that we become killjoys against the promised ludic futures of the digital economy, because in this moment of rising global authoritarianism and the global pandemic, right? I think it's obvious that it was obvious for some of us that governments and corporations do not really care too much about us. So I think, and also as academics who tend to love doing research or writing or reflecting on things, I think there should be a way that we can learn from feminist researchers about how to say no, right? How to set boundaries about work and non-work. And again, learning to become killjoys could be a really good step to rethinking how we can attach ourselves to work and hopefully have some life. And that's going to be the end of my talk. Thank you so much for your attention.
Fantastic. Let me take the slide off. Okay. Ergin, congratulations. I mean, I think congratulations are in order. This is such an enticing research. There's such a depth in all things you've explored in this research. We couldn't help but comment in our private channel of how thorough you were on the process of researching for this book. So congratulations on it. We are really impressed, and it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much for being here and explaining all of this to us, and we're really grateful for that. I think
Thank you.
agrees with me on this. Ivan?
Yeah, I want to thank you, Ergin, a lot for the amazing talk. Our chat is really discussing the topic on its own by now, but it was very interesting also to follow the discussion along with your talk. So I'm going to read the first question from Daniel Marques, and he asked in English. So I'm showing the question in the screen right now. Are you able to read it?
Yes,
so I'm
I'm
going
very
to.
interested in.
Yeah, I'm going to translate the question to Portuguese for the chat while you read.
Okay.
So feel free to answer after I'm done translating. Bom, então o Daniel pergunta para o Ergin, estou muito interessado em como a dinâmica do ambiente de trabalho, essa cultura do ambiente de trabalho se tornou presente no mundo dos games e da tecnologia. Além das indústrias de mídia tradicionais, você percebe alguma influência do Vale do Silício? I think you also talked about the topic, but Daniel made the question before, so if you want to talk about it further.
Yeah, so there were definitely influences from Silicon Valley, in terms of, this whole libertarian kind of work ethos where the technology is your manifest destiny. It's yours. You should be able to expand and do new things, and the outcome is going to be exciting, right? So there are lots of connections to be made between the colonial logic and that libertarian kind of work ethos that was there. But I also have to say that because of the Midwest kind of ecology, it wasn't quite the Silicon Valley or, New York East Coast kind of mentality, which was, this was a major studio, but at the same time, it was not part of the, it was not like Silicon Valley where you have a few game studios, you have Facebook, Apple, whatever, like all with a drive kind of thing, right? So I was able to see those links, but there was a modest kind of version of Silicon Valley. They knew that they were not part of that ecology, and I think that's something I haven't emphasized in the talk. But these people mostly actually were from the Midwest, and they basically preferred to live there, right? So they said, I cannot really mess with the traffic or life in New York. Silicon Valley is far from my family. This is where I prefer to live, right? So they actually had that relatively slow life pace that they desired to be in. So yes, connections, but at the same time, somewhat like this distant attitude to what you would have in Silicon Valley.
Ivan, tá mudo seu microfone.
Sorry. So Daniel had a follow-up question asking if you encountered any resistance from the studio or the parent company while doing your fieldwork? Bom, o Daniel pergunta se o Ergin encontrou alguma resistência por parte do estúdio ou pelo estúdio que tinha a empresa que comprou o estúdio depois, enquanto ele estava fazendo o trabalho de campo.
No, I haven't. Except we count cynicism as resistance. Then yes, you know, they were quite cynical about how the parent company screwed things up, and they were being punished, right, by their decisions. They were telling me things like, you know, they bought so many bad studios, and we have been punished, you know, but because of their bad investment decisions. So they were kind of saying, this is not how things should be like. We worked hard, we made the best games, and here we are, you know, being punished as opposed to being rewarded by the hard work. But you know, the moment of pause, when I asked them questions about unions, I did pose this question to them, right? So what do you think about unions? Do you think that they might be of some use? Some of the developers had that brief moment of reflection, and that's, I think, another fun part of doing fieldwork, where you see those like moments of reflection. They would be like, unions. Like, it was like the first time that, you know, they were thinking about this, right? And on the one hand, they would start by saying, well, you know, unions would not be quite useful for our industry because of X, Y, Z. But as they talked, they would also come back to the idea that, well, maybe they might be. So, you know, they would be ambivalent about whether unions can or may not be useful. So, you know, maybe there is some space to explore those moments of resistance, but not in an active way.
Ok, vou traduzir rapidinho o que ele respondeu. So, Ergin, I'm just going to translate briefly your answers for the chat. Bom, para a primeira pergunta do Daniel, que falava sobre essa questão da relação entre a mídia tradicional e o Vale do Silício, o Ergin falou que existe sim uma influência do Vale do Silício, que tem essa cultura mais, digamos assim, mais lúdica mesmo, né, do trabalho, que tem a ver com essa ideia da ludopolítica que ele propõe, mas que o estúdio que ele estudou está sediado no meio oeste americano, né, que tem um outro estilo de vida, que não são grandes cidades, grandes metrópoles, né? Então as pessoas, ao mesmo tempo, elas compreendiam que elas não faziam parte desse ambiente mais cosmopolita mesmo das metrópoles americanas, né? E que isso influenciava. Sim.
Elas eram de lá do meio oeste, né? Então elas estavam interessadas em continuar. O meio oeste americano tem essa coisa bairrista resistente às grandes cidades, né? Então vai mais ou menos por aí esse pensamento.
Sim, sim. E é isso, né? Então eles tinham, é óbvio que tem essa influência, mas que isso tem um contrapeso aí por uma questão cultural local ali mesmo do meio oeste. Então é interessante você ver essa variabilidade também dessa questão. Segundo lugar, o Daniel perguntou sobre a questão da resistência do estúdio, né? E o Ergin falou que não houve essa resistência, mas que ele viu um certo atrito, né? Um certo conflito no momento que, depois que o estúdio é comprado por uma empresa maior, né? Que eles percebem uma certa uma frustração por terem feito um ótimo trabalho e conseguido essa conquista, né, que é essa compra por uma empresa de ordem superior e tal, mas não terem visto um retorno imediato nesse trabalho duro que eles tiveram, né? E aí ele comenta também sobre a questão dos sindicatos, que é uma coisa que o pessoal conversou bastante aí no chat, que ele percebeu que havia uma certa ambiguidade das pessoas em relação a essa questão, né? Porque elas percebiam, talvez fosse útil, mas talvez não, né? Nessa indústria dos games, talvez não combine muito a questão do sindicato, e que talvez exista aí uma brecha, né, para você convencer esses trabalhadores da tecnologia a se sindicalizarem.
I would like to follow up on that topic on unions. Do you think this kind of displacing or deflecting thought about unions you perceived on your interviews, it stems from American liberal thinking in any way? I mean, what I'm actually asking you is, do you think these people you interviewed, they uh, they they really thought about unionizing, I mean, practically, before your question was made to them, or you felt your question actually, well, I mean, produced this result because it was the first time ever they were hearing about the idea of unionizing?
Like Martina, for instance, right? The game tester that I talked to a few times. For her, it was definitely the first time when I asked this question. Or a designer, a lead designer that I talked to. I'm sure it was the first time that he thought about this question of unions. Somewhere, I think, somewhere, some had definitely discussed the idea of unionization with colleagues, and they did have like opinions, and you could tell that they had given some thought about this. But again, going back to the spouses of these game developers, when I was interviewing them, Gina, the witty IT professional, she said she kind of made fun of her husband and their colleagues, kind of suggesting, oh, they're all libertarians. They tend to think that it's all about their hard work, it's all about individual. They don't really care about public schools or how they drive on the roads that are made by the taxes that we all pay, right? So you could see those kinds of previous reflections about, democracy, unions, and what a labor movement could contribute to a better kind of life. So yeah, with some you could see that they have these discussions, but for some it was just like the blue screen of the computer. Wait a minute, unions, where is this coming from, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. Let me translate for the chat. Então, eu perguntei, gente, ainda sobre essa coisa da ideia de resistência, né, da sindicalização. Se isso de alguma forma tem a ver com a ideia americana de simplesmente, né, da ideia neoliberal americana clássica. Se você pensar, os Estados Unidos são uma das raízes, né, dessa sociedade neoliberal. Se era a primeira vez que essas pessoas estavam ouvindo falar de sindicalização quando ele perguntou. E ele disse que para Martina, que eu acho que era artista gráfico, se não me engano, me corrija.
Era tester.
Tester, pronto. Para Martina, certamente, assim, primeira vez e impressionantemente, ele até fala assim, dá uma tela azul mesmo na cabeça da pessoa, como assim, de onde está vindo essa ideia de sindicalização. Mas que a Gina, que era programadora, eu acho, né, IT, ela tinha e ela é cínica de alguma forma, né, sarcástica de alguma forma, e ela tira uma onda dos seus colegas, inclusive o marido dela trabalha na empresa também, ela tira uma onda dos caras, porque diz assim, eles pensam individualmente no poder do trabalho, da meritocracia, e não estão preocupados com como as coisas funcionam no mundo real, né? Quem faz, por exemplo, a estrada que você dirige, que paga com os seus com os impostos e assim por diante. Então, para algumas pessoas, sim, para a maioria, né? É o que parece, ele diz, assim, foi a primeira vez que ouviram falar de sindicalização, mas para essa pessoa em específico, não. Assim, já tinha pensado um bocado. Mais perguntas aí, Ivan?
Sim, I'm going to put a question in Portuguese for you in the screen, Ergin. So I'm going to translate for you now. And o pessoal do chat pode ler aí a pergunta da Juliette. Só um segundo, just a second. So considering these affective and structurally unequal factors, is it possible to make any approximation of this precarious phenomenon with the case of GameStop recently? I think she's talking about the GameStop stocks case. Maybe do you see any connection between the question of labor and precarity in the game industry and that case at all?
I would say so. I haven't followed the GameStop case very closely, but I know of it. But I would imagine the kind of critique of precarity in GameStop and what I see in my field, I think are part of the same spectrum, but I think they are in different kinds of degrees. Where in GameStop, if I am not mistaken, the level of radical critique was very like sharp, as opposed to the lack of critique that I, didn't see basically in my fieldwork. So, and I think that's what makes gaming cultures quite interesting and exciting, in the sense that on the one hand, there's a lot of, cultivation of alternative right or fascist, however you want to call it, tendencies that you get to see in these gaming communities. But at the same time, socialist, radical gaming communities are not willing to give up that space either. So I think, and this is stating the obvious, but gaming is one of those realms of battle, like the culture war kind of phenomenon that we get to see within gaming culture. But I would love to hear from Juliet. I think that's the person who posed the question, if she or he sees those connections between the case I presented and GameStop too.
Bom, então a pergunta da Juliette, né, que era sobre GameStop, o Ergin responde que ele vê uma questão de precariedade, principalmente na questão da GameStop pelos funcionários e tal, que tem uma questão, mas que ele enxerga como algo paralelo, né, um outro tipo de fenômeno de precarização. E aí ele fala dessa questão das culturas e da cultura dos games, da indústria dos games, como produz diferentes formas mesmo de pensamento. Ele fala sobre isso como uma espécie de guerra cultural, né, dentro dos games, que apresenta essa questão, e fala também que está curioso para saber qual relação que a Juliette vê entre esse fenômeno da GameStop e a questão da precarização do trabalho, né? Então, se a Juliette quiser digitar ali mais tarde, se der tempo, a gente repercute aí a resposta dela.
Vamos nessa pergunta do Léo aqui. Leonardo.
Fala mais alto.
Tá, peraí. Léo, melhorou?
Melhorou.
Okay. Leo is asking, what is the role of specialized press in this romanticization of work in the game industry? Let me just translate it to Portuguese. Qual é o papel da imprensa especializada, né, nessa romantização do trabalho na indústria dos games? Ergin.
There is definitely, a lot that the industry press has done to construct that romantic notion of work, and also the ideal gamer, right, the ideal game maker who is passionate about work and so on. I think it's there, but also I would suggest that the Protestant work ethic has done a lot on its own to make sure that work is about to occupy a very central role in one's life anyway. So there's that too. But I also have to say that I think industrial press is also there's really interesting fierce criticism of this romantic notion of work in industry press too, right? So I think crunch is not a secret, right? Like industry press has written a lot about this. So the thing is, I think whether the extent to which the industry will try to reimagine better ways of engaging with work, right? Because again, I think one of the ultimate question is that the industry has to ask is, if you keep building more, if you keep making more, if you keep expanding your game universe, right? What happens to your workforce, right? So what happens to their families? I think that's a central question to pose. Is this, let's name it basically for the industry, is this capitalist form of life sustainable, right? It can be sustainable in the short or mid-term. It can help you to make profits. But the thing is, which is I think we have to remember as game scholars, that workers have bodies, right? I mean, they're not digital cyborg like people think. People look at the screen, and at some point it just is too much taxing. So, which is another, I guess, burning question for us about, how to recenter the body in relation to this idea of work. How sustainable, again, is this? So the press has definitely played a role, and I think there's a lot of backlash against this these days too. It's just up to the industry whether to learn from this and then remake itself.
Português. Então, ele diz o seguinte, gente, que a imprensa certamente tem um papel nisso. Talvez nem seja o que a gente espera ouvir, o que ele diz. Que a imprensa certamente tem um papel nisso, mas que a imprensa também é muito crítica da cultura do crunch, né? Porque, de alguma forma, percebe-se que a imprensa assim, não compactua com a ideia do crunch. Ela está muito e aí, bom, ele leva para uma discussão sobre a vivência do capital, né, ou no capital, a vivência de que diz, bom, a gente tem corpo, a gente vive, a gente precisa ter uma certa qualidade de vida, e enquanto eu tento expandir os meus mundos de jogo, o que vai acontecer com a minha força de trabalho, né? Eu acho que isso de alguma forma se conecta com aquilo que o Tomás do Expansion Pack, o Fernando do Holodeck Design, do Regras do Jogo, e o Gamer Antifascista também estavam falando recentemente sobre, assim, repercutindo aquele discurso de queremos jogos menores, mais cuidadosos, etc, etc. É uma coisa que a gente vem discutindo nas lives frequentemente, né?
Temos aqui uma pergunta do Kenneth. So, Ergin, another question in Portuguese. I'll do my best to translate it because it's a very, very long question. So, let's start with it. Just a second. So, much of what you have described about the premises of the work in the game industry, I have seen represented in areas such as communication and journalism, which is my background. Working for love, flexible hours, having fun in the environment, and so on. So I was thinking, is this all an incentive for individualistic thinking, or avoiding practices like unionization? Do game unions not go too far because of this ideology? So that's the question from Kenneth.
That's a great question. From what I know, based on the research in Game Workers Unite, they actually are doing all kinds of deconstructive work to suggest that you can love your job and still protect yourself from overexploitation. So I think they're doing a good job in terms of, criticizing that discourse of individualism and so on. But as you were suggesting, this is very common. This whole idea of love, flexibility, and so on is very common across media industries, and with distinct features in every industry. I guess one way to think about this, right, about this whole idea of love, and I draw on the work of Kathy Weeks here, who has written an excellent article on love titled "Down with Love." So, on the one hand, we can think about this whole idea of love as a, top-down corporate propaganda. But at the same time, she talks about how it is also something cultivated from below, in terms of how, like, we become subjects, basically. It is not just all about, like, dictation and, like, top-down propaganda. And that's what I was trying to do in my book, in terms of how, people learn to love, right? Going back to the classic work of Paul Willis, we learn to love things when we play with games, right? Of course, we read from press. Of course, we are subjected to propaganda and so on. That's there. But at the same time, it's through very ordinary practices that love gets to be cultivated, right? Because no matter how much you are under this propaganda, right, unless you really practice it and unless you really feel it, right, with those practices, then propaganda can only go so far. So I think that's something that I hope to have made clear by mentioning this. Was there another part of the question that I missed?
So I think the last part of the question is about if you see this propaganda of love as a condition for the lack of advancements in unionization. And this question by Kenneth started the whole discussion in the chat about unions and their role in today's work life. So it was very interesting because of that.
I see.
So that's
no, I would agree, because like I was saying, some people, when I asked them the question about unions, they would say how they were not really workers, they were more like creative individuals, right? So that sort of puts an obstacle to the idea of unionization, because for them, and some even actually describe their father's jobs in the tobacco industry and then their own job as a game worker, right? And they would basically make comparisons between how dad is a worker, he does this, I'm a creative individual, I do this, so my job is not really something that I can think about unionization. So in that regard, I totally agree with Kenneth in the sense that the idea of individual work, it's all about, passion, and what I do is not quite quantifiable and classifiable to put me in a union, right? Is definitely there. So I would say yes.
Ok, traduzindo rápido a resposta do Ergin sobre essa pergunta do Kenneth, ele diz que vê sim relações entre a questão dos games e outras indústrias, né? Ele fala sobre essa questão da ideia de amor, né? Que a gente pode ver de duas maneiras, basicamente. Em primeiro lugar, a gente pode ver como uma propaganda vinda de cima, né? Vindo da indústria, né? Que ela vende essa ideia de que as pessoas têm que amar jogar videogames e, portanto, amar trabalhar na indústria de games. Mas ele considera essa visão um pouco simplória demais, né? Porque para a gente viver esse amor, a gente tem que nos treinar para pensar dessa maneira, né? Então ele cita uma autora que, confesso que agora eu não vou me recordar, mas que a gente pode voltar depois e mandar no Twitter e tal, que fala sobre essa questão de como essa propaganda, né, ela surge de baixo também, as pessoas constroem, e dá para ver isso um pouco no momento que ele fala sobre como as pessoas pregam esse libertarianismo, né, esse ancapismo dentro do ambiente de trabalho dos games, né? Ou seja, que isso é cultivado de baixo para cima também, não é só uma coisa que os capitalistas inventam para fazer uma lavagem cerebral, né? Ele fala que as pessoas aprendem esse amor, né, entre aspas, e que você precisa praticar propaganda. E aí, sobre a questão da sindicalização, que foi uma coisa que o Edu também discutiu muito aí, o pessoal estava falando sobre, ele fala que existe uma barreira dessas pessoas em se pensarem como trabalhadores, né? E ele dá o exemplo de um trabalhador que fala sobre a diferença entre o que ele faz, que ele entende que não é um trabalho da maneira clássica, e sim uma espécie de função criativa, né? E aí eu concordo com o Kenneth que isso é um pensamento do trabalho como uma coisa individual, né? Você como criador, artista, pensando, como que você vai pensar isso em termos de sindicato, que é uma coisa coletiva, né? E aí ele fala desse trabalhador que não conseguia se comparar como trabalhador de games com sei lá, o pai dele que trabalhava numa fábrica, né? Alguma coisa desse tipo. E que esse trabalho não seria classificável dentro dessa ideia de sindicalização. Acho que é isso.
So, I think this is it, Ergin. We are again very grateful for your presence in here. It was really a delightful moment. It's not very useful. It's not very usual for us to be online in the morning. We usually do our broadcasts in the afternoon, or in the night, in the evening, and it was really a nice change of pace. And thank you for. Let me just explain something in Portuguese. É porque, gente, a gente não faz muita coisa de manhã, né? Por motivos óbvios, né? Tá todo mundo trabalhando de manhã e tal, mas o Ergin tá às 6 horas da gente, né? Então vai dar meio-dia aqui, vai dar 6 horas da tarde lá, e aí eu sei bem que é hora de botar o neném para dormir essa hora. I was just telling people that since you are 6 hours in front of us, we are 6 hours behind you, or the opposite. By now it might be time to put the baby in the bed, right? Tuck him in. And thank you so much for being with us this morning, this afternoon for you. It was really very, very enlightening, both entertaining and enlightening. So I hope we progress on this dialogue. I hope we have projects together so we can materialize this discourse, right? And I'll pass to Ivan now, and then you for your last remarks, and we will end up the broadcast.
So thank you a lot, Ergin. It was very, very stimulating talk. In the chat, people are still discussing things. So for my own research, I also thought about a lot of topics. So thank you a lot for the amazing talk. And I'm going to briefly thank the chat in Portuguese. So, pessoal do chat, obrigado. Desculpa por não ter dado para fazer todas as perguntas, mas aí a gente também percebe que a discussão no chat já vira um valor em si mesmo, né? Não necessariamente precisa chegar aqui no vídeo, né? Então, muito obrigado por isso. So, Ergin, your closing remarks. Thank you a lot again.
Thank you very much, Ivan and Thiago. The honor and pleasure is mine, truly. I wish I had some command of Portuguese to be able to, engage with you in Portuguese and get in touch with colleagues in the comment section. But this was very great, and thanks for accommodating the time difference. And as you said, Thiago, I look forward to connecting with you and Ivan and other colleagues with different kinds of conversations and projects in the future. And I hope everyone and everyone's family are doing well given the circumstances. And again, going back to the final slide, I guess nothing is more important than our beloved families' well-being and the future of humanity. So work less, try to survive through this pandemic, and hope to be in more social environments once this is over, in real time and real space with all of you. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Quer traduzir, Ivan?
Bom, então agradeceu a todo mundo, falou que gostaria de saber português um pouco melhor para poder conversar com o pessoal no chat, e que espera que todo mundo esteja bem devido às circunstâncias da pandemia no Brasil, e que está animado para as próximas discussões, quem sabe em ambientes mais sociáveis, né? Menos online, mais offline.
Pessoais.
Pessoais, E é isso.
É isso, pessoal. Então, valeu a todo mundo. Quem não segue a gente nas redes sociais, por favor, siga aí. Estamos sempre lá. Obrigado mais uma vez. Muito obrigado, Ivan, pelo help aqui. E até a próxima. A gente volta com a Metagame Speaker Series apenas em abril? Abril. Até porque hoje é março já, então só em abril mesmo. Valeu, galera. E até a próxima.